Honorable guest, Professor Dr. Sami Al Arian, honorable listeners from different parts of the world, especially from the Bangladesh and all the others, I would like to say you my salam, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. We will start our program with the recitation of Holy Quran. Our brother Jayed Ansari Masum will recite from the Holy Quran.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إن الذين قالوا ربنا الله ثم استقاموا تتنزل عليهم الملائكة ألا تخافوا ولا تحزنوا وأبشروا بالجنة التي كنتم توعدون. نحن أولياؤكم في الحياة الدنيا وفي الآخرة ولكم فيها ما تشتهي أنفسكم ولكم فيها ما تدعون. نزلا من غفور رحيم. نزلا من غفور رحيم. صدق الله العظيم.
Jazakallah, Brother Jayed Ansari Masum. Today, we will listen from our honorable professor about the topic of the formation of New World Order. My honorable brothers and sisters, we know now we can see in the world that Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and many other Muslim countries, they were facing problems. There are also oppressions in Palestine, Myanmar, Kashmir, and some other countries also. We have witnessed those in the Muslim world. But if we see now, especially previous 1 year, we can see there is also a world war in Europe. And for that war, the whole Western countries, they have got tempted and they're really on the verge of another war. Though as a Muslim, we cannot support any oppressions or war to any kind of people, doesn't matter from which race, religion, or ethnicity is from. But unfortunately, in this situation, as a Muslim youth, what we have to do, what is our role, what we can do, we should think about that, I think. And that's why we have got today a very prominent expert from Palestine, Professor Dr. Sami Al Arian. Before going to our Ustad, I will just recite his short biography. Professor Dr. Sami Al Arian is the director of the Center for Islam and Global Affairs, SIGA, and Public Affairs Professor at University of Istanbul, Sabahattin Zaim. He received his PhD in 1986 and was a tenured academic in the US for 2 decades, receiving Best Teaching Award at the University of South Florida on 1993 and 94. and several grants also. He also had over 40 publications to his credit. During his 4 decades in the US, in 1975 to 2015, Dr. Arian founded numerous institutions and publications in the field of education, research, religion, and interfaith. As well as he has some civil and human rights activities. He was a prolific speaker across many US campuses, especially on Palestine, Islam, and the West, and civil rights. In 2001, he was named by Newsweek the premier civil rights activist in the US for his efforts to repeal the use of secret evidence in immigration courts. In 2012, he was profiled by historians in the Encyclopedia of American Dissidents as one of only 3 Muslims in the US out of 152 dissidents and prisoners of conscience that were included in the series in the past century. The other 2 were Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali. His US story was featured in 2007 in the award-winning documentary US versus Arian, and in 2016 in the book Being Palestinian. Dr. Al Arian has written several studies and numerous articles focusing on US foreign policy, Palestine, and the Arab Spring phenomena. His book on poetry on spirituality, Palestine, and human rights conspiring against Joseph was published in 2004. He is also the author of The Arab Awakening Unveiled, Understanding Transformation and Revolution in the Middle East, Washington, D.C., American Educational Trust, 2013, and The United States and Israel, From Enable to Strategic Partners. It was published from Istanbul Zaim University Publications in 2019. Honorable brothers and sisters, I would like to invite our honorable guest, Professor Dr. Sami Al Arian, to give us valuable speech on the topic of the formation of New World Order among us. Professor, the microphone is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Muhammad, for your kind introduction, and thank you for the Institute of Thought and Research for inviting me, and thank you for the audience for being here. I'll try to be brief so I can give information, give time rather for people to ask questions. The topic for today is the formation of New World Order. When we talk about a world order, we talk about a world or international system that is shaped by the great powers that exist within that system. Ever since the end of World War II, the United States has emerged as the most powerful state within that international system. It shaped the world order, and because of its dominance, particularly as the world was shaping at the time with many countries being destroyed, with the exception, of course, of the United States, because it fought late in the war and also outside its boundaries. But also it faced not only dominance right after World War II, but there was also the emergence of the USSR at the time, or what's called Soviet Union. It also has emerged as a peer competitor. So that's when we had what was called the bipolar in the system. In other words, 2 great powers within the system. But of course, the United States had many advantages. It shaped the world order in order to maintain its dominance and also expand it. It wanted to expand its hegemonic control through establishing many structures, many institutions, political, military, economic, and others. Throughout the years, the United States dominated world politics through these architectures that it built not only after World War II, but even before the end of the war. Politically, the idea of the United Nations and the Security Council with veto powers for particular great powers, the Organization of American States, where it dominates the Western Hemisphere. In terms of military alliances and military pacts, you find NATO, which is based in Europe, along European countries, and to dominate militarily Europe, which was the theater of 2 world wars in the last century. You also have other military alliances, particularly in the Pacific, with Japan and South Korea. And recently we heard about the Quad and AUKUS, where you have Australia, United Kingdom, and so on. And also it built over 800 military bases around the world, which makes it basically a world power with military hegemony. Militarily, it has 7 commands with almost 11 fleets, 7 roaming the world any time of the day. The 7 commands are the Pacific Command, the European Command, which is NATO, the AFRICOM, which is newly constructed, the last one, CENTCOM, which controls the Middle East. 23 countries are integrated within that theater of operation. And also the Northern and Southern Command, the one that is the homeland, the Northern and the Southern is Latin America, in addition to the Space Command, where one dominates space as well. It also wanted to control trade routes and access to the most important waterways and geostrategic parts on Earth. All these structures are military structures that makes it obviously very dominant and very powerful in comparison to its peers, whether it was the Soviet Union or whatever other nation that emerges as a competitor. On the economic side, the United States wants it also to dominate economically speaking, so it constructed or established the World Bank, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and of course in the 90s, which came after GATT, the World Trade Organizations, the Bank of International Settlements in Switzerland, the SWIFT banking system, where it can control basically any money transaction, many free trade agreements, and so on and so forth. But most importantly, it wanted to dominate the economic system, starting from 1944 in the Bretton Woods system, where during Roosevelt, who was the 32nd president of the United States, where it pegged the dollar with the gold. In other words, it promised that for every, I believe it was $35, any person could exchange that for an ounce of gold, no questions asked. In other words, you don't have to own gold. All what you have to do is own dollars, and we can exchange at a fixed rate anytime you want. And of course, at the time, the United States had over half of the world's gold bullion at the time. But of course, over time, it could not maintain that system. But that dominance of the dollar was very important for its world dominance. Even though Nixon delinked the dollar with the gold in 1971, the United States wanted to keep the dollar as the reserve currency of the world. To do that, it was very clever plan or scheme where Kissinger, who was the Secretary of State at the time, struck a deal with King Faisal of Saudi Arabia in 1974, where the oil, which is the most produced commodity in the world. Today, we're talking about in the neighborhood of 90 to 100 million barrels a day, that it will only be sold in dollars. Since Saudi Arabia dominated oil politics, they accepted that in exchange for protection from the United States to the ruling family in Saudi Arabia, which meant that you have a commodity that produces tens of millions of barrels every day. When it is sold in dollars, that means the real owner of that oil will be the one who actually print the dollar. And since the world has to have this, they have to produce dollars to buy that oil. That means they have to get that dollars from the United States. This is how you maintain a system if your currency is dominant within that system, then you can obviously print as many dollars with very few consequences. The United States is the only country in the world, actually, today that can print money with very little consequence. As an example, the United States had 46 presidents, starting from 1789 of George Washington, who was the first president, until about the 39th president was Jimmy Carter in 1980, for almost 2 centuries. The national debt of the United States reached about $500 million. 4 years later, around midterm of the 40th president, Ronald Reagan, it reached about 1 trillion. But since then, since the mid-80s until today, we're talking about less than 4 decades, the amount of national debt that the United States accumulated in these less than 40 years today is over $31 trillion. When it reached Reagan, it was 1 trillion. And since then, it multiplied 30 times. In other words, the United States owes itself, because it doesn't have any cover for that printing, about $31 trillion, and with very little consequence for its economy. The reason that is because the United States dominates, the dollar dominates world economies, and because no one will hold it accountable. No one is going to tell it, how come you're doing this? Because it is the most powerful pole in this system. In other words, any change in the status quo, any change to that system, to that order, is going to cost the United States huge, particularly when it comes to the economic side. So while inflation for the US today is about 7 or 8%, which is unusual for the past 40 years, yet in other parts of the world where the government starts printing money, what happens is that that inflation becomes out of control, could reach 50%, 60%. Here in Turkey, even it's reached 85, 86%. So you could see how that system is benefiting the most powerful pole in that system, even though it keeps printing money beyond its means. If you are printing, during the pandemic, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the US printed more than it took, almost $6 trillion. When Obama left this, I think it was around 24, 25, and during the past 4 or 5 years, it printed, or it increased its national debt by almost $7.5 trillion. Not to say much about US private debt. In other words, this is the government debt. We have almost $85 trillion also on the private debt. All this money is not covered. All this money is just funny money, meaning it's zeros in the banks, somebody banks, but it's still not impacting the economy the way it would have been otherwise, particularly when we're talking about countries where these kind of activities would impact its economy in a very adverse way. Now, to reach that point, for the US to build that architecture, to build that world structure, to be able to dominate the world in many ways, of course, that came through different phases. They had different grand strategies. And what I would like to do is just to give a brief about what the grand strategy is and how it's being used in a way that will give privilege to the strongest country once it builds itself into becoming the primary world power. Now, grand strategy describes basically a broad consensus of the state's highest strategy, which consider the long-term consequences of using all of its instruments of national power, whether it's military, economy, diplomatic, information, culture, what have you. It trying to bring all these capabilities together for a major or strategic or grand goal. Now, within that we need to differentiate between what the grand strategy is, what the strategy is, and what foreign policy is. The grand strategy answers the question of why. Strategy answers the question of how, and foreign policy answers the question of what. So we do not need to mix these things or confuse them. The US grand strategy now, obviously, is to dominate the world and keep that dominance. But that didn't come overnight. Grand strategies go through different phases until you reach a certain milestone, and then you can switch to another grand strategy. The United States, when it was established back in the 1780s, it wasn't really that strong at all. I mean, it came out of a colonialist experience with Britain, even though most of the people were white people, but yet they were colonized by England at the time, by the United Kingdom at the time. And of course, it emerged as first a weak confederate state, then a federal state, then it consolidated its power and began its quest to become a world power. That grand strategy, that first grand strategy, took place between the 1780s until about the 1880s, for almost a century or more. And the grand strategy was to build this nation's territorial and economic foundations to become a power. And to do that, they had to consolidate territorially. So they basically invaded all the indigenous nations. They had to indulge into several wars, they're called the Indian Wars, but of course, these are people who were indigenous, not Indian. It had wars with Mexico, so it acquired all the Western states. It purchased land from Napoleonic France, who was he had his own wars in Europe during the Napoleonic Wars. That's almost a quarter of the United States, what's called the Louisiana Purchase. It purchased also Alaska in the northern western side of the continent from Russia, from Caesar, from Russia before the Bolshevik Revolution. At any rate, they consolidated most of the northern, what is called today the United States, or the northern plain of the Americas, and it built itself into a one nation, one united nation, one United States that came to again at the expense of many other nations. But with that also, by the 8th president in 1883, what's called the Monroe Doctrine, that president had a doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine meant that the US will not allow for any foreign, particularly European powers, to have military bases in the hemisphere, so that they can be sure that they will be the dominant force or the dominant power in that hemisphere. That almost also took a century to realize. It was part of the World War II entry of the United States to make sure that whoever was left of these European empires in the Western Hemisphere, particularly in Latin America, that they will no longer exist. They will no longer have any military threat, or could be a potential military threat in the future. Of course, with that, the US was able to protect itself on both east and west. You only have huge oceans that would prevent any kind of serious threat to it or invasion. And also from north and south, because there are no looming military threats, since all great powers have basically abandoned any military presence. That's why when the Cuban Missile Crisis took place in 1962, the US saw this as existential threat. Having Soviet missiles that potentially could also have nuclear weapons or nuclear rockets, that meant a grave threat, and the world was on the verge of having a nuclear war at the time, until the Soviets decided to withdraw in exchange for Americans withdrawing their own missiles from Turkey. At any rate, the idea here is that this was a grand strategy of the United States. The first one took place, which is, as I said, the first grand strategy for over 100 years, which involved perhaps from the first president to the 25th president. The second grand strategy, that once the United States consolidated its power and was able to dominate its Western hemisphere, was to become a world power, to go outside its Western hemisphere. After also it built a great navy, because that process also took almost 20 years to build a great navy so that it can go outside its comfort zone, the oceans, and throughout the world, not only to control all the waterways, the major waterways around the world, but also to control the trade routes that existed, which could give it a huge leverage and a huge advantage over its rivalries. And that also took place for almost the next 50 years. So by World War II, what that means from the 26th president almost to the 32nd or 33rd president, by that time you had Truman to consolidate and become not only a great power, but also the dominant power across the globe. After World War II, as I said earlier, the United States came relatively speaking, much stronger than all the other powers combined. And that gave it a great advantage. And then it pursued, it was able to build this architecture, to build this world order to its liking. Just to give a comparison, in the aftermath of World War I, the president at the time was Wilson. Wilson was not able to convince much of the elites there for the United States to participate in that architecture, even though the United States helped in building it, because many people thought that this is no longer feasible. We're not going to be dominant. You still have great powers, particularly Britain and France, and there was a weakened Germany. At any rate, there was no consensus for the U.S. to become a major player. So they stayed within their own. Obviously, they will still have a lot of interest in economically. But that system also collapsed towards the end of the 1920s. But by the 1940s, as the people, as the world was coming out of World War II, there was a different kind of thinking that this is the opportune time. This is the best time for the United States to actually lead the world and bring about the changes and the shape and the structure and the architecture in the different systems in that world to its liking and to its advantage. Sorry, I got something here. All right, that system stayed, as I said, to the advantage of the US, but also the emergence of the USSR, which is the Soviet Union at the time. The grand strategy of the US was to contain any emerging threat. And the USSR presented a threat, which meant that the strategy of the US is to contain it and create what is called a balance of power. It's really a misnomer, because what is meant by that is that if there is any emerging power, great power, that could impact its region, meaning it wants to dominate its region. So the Soviet Union wanted to dominate Europe, certainly, and even beyond. That the policy or the strategy of the US must be to create a balancing power, whether it is one power or a group of powers, an alliance of powers, in order to check that emerging power. So every time you want to understand the policy of the US, you have to see what is the target, which country is the target, which one is the emerging power, and what is the United States doing to contain or to face up to this power. Just to give you an example, again, from previous history as well as from current history, at the time of the USSR, the United States created NATO. So NATO will bring a group of European powers together in order to challenge the Soviet Union. Why do they want to do that? One, of course, is not to have that power dominate its region, because if it feels comfortable and dominates its region, then it would feel more emboldened to go and challenge the United States outside its region in different parts of the world. That's why you have the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine does not allow any foreign great power, foreign meaning outside the area, to dominate that region so that the United States will feel comfortable, never feel threatened. That gives the United States the ability to go outside its region and flex its muscle and dictate its policies. So it created NATO and other architectures around the Soviet Union in order to contain it, in order to not give it the space that will make it comfortable, whether to dominate its region or go outside and challenge US supremacy outside its region. Or some people may think what's happening, for example, as a current example from current affairs, is what's happening in northern Syria. And I always give this example, is that the real reason the United States built these, at one point it had 13 military bases in northern Syria, now it's much less, has nothing to do with ISIS as it was advertised. It really has to do much with checking Turkey's power. The US saw in Turkey, particularly in the past 2 decades, a regime where they're trying to go outside the ability to project its power in its region. They thought that what the current regime is trying to do is to become more powerful, to dominate its region, but even go beyond, as we saw in different parts. They exist today in North Africa, in Libya, in Africa, in Somalia, and other places, in Azerbaijan and other places. And the United States doesn't like that, doesn't like to see countries going outside or dominating their region. So one way to check Turkey is to create a rivalry, a balancing power. But when you look at Turkey's neighbors, most of them are weak, whether it's Greece, Bulgaria, Armenia, Georgia. Of course, Iraq is a basket case, and Syria is totally in a civil war mode. So the best way to check Turkey's power was to empower the northern part of Syria, which is dominated by Kurdish forces, which are tied to PKK, which is the historic nemesis, the historic threat. And this is a group that is being designated as terrorist group, not only in Turkey, but throughout much of the Western world. And therefore, empowering the Kurdish regions in Syria, which its ties to PKK, will immediately get Turkey's attention and make it do a 180 degrees return in order to face up to this challenge, because this challenge is not just a foreign challenge, because 20% of Turkey's population is Kurdish. This potentially could be a huge challenge that could even threaten the breakup of the country. So this is how you could see and understand American policy and strategy. When Trump, of his own reasons that has nothing to do with the state or the national security policy of the United States, when he decided to withdraw some of these forces, even that got the Secretary of Defense at the time, Jim Mattis, to resign, because he thought that this was a huge thing, that this is a huge policy reversal. This is a policy that cost them billions of dollars of training over 50,000 Kurds and trying to empower them, give them oil fields so that they can be independent, and give them heavy military and so on and so forth. So you could see how the US acts when it sees these kind of emerging powers that would change the architecture or the structure that it built. Same thing happening in the Pacific. It tries to build different kinds of alliances. Some of them are political, some military, some trade and economic, in order to contain China. The US policy in that part of the world is not to allow the Chinese to dominate or to be the regional hegemon, whether in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, or across the Pacific or across the East, so to speak. So it builds or deepens its alliance with Japan, with South Korea, with the Philippines, even with India, because it sees that these powers coming together could actually check the rising power of China. Now, the United States, after the fall of the Soviet Union, this grand strategy of containment, which was very successful because eventually, with all the pressure it applied on that regime, the Soviet Union collapsed. By 1991, we really had no Soviet Union anymore. And the United States was faced with adopting many strategies, many grand strategies. There was a study by the Department of Navy that was published in 2011, in which it cited all the possible grand strategies. It cited 6. 2 of them, of course, were non-serious. They were not really very serious. It just for completion, they included them. One was isolationism, which was totally, overwhelmingly and by consensus rejected by the foreign policy elite in the United States, or what's called world government. In other words, to form a world government and be at the head of it, that's not even serious. But the other 4 were actual possibilities that the United States could have adopted any one of them. Offensive realists or realists like John Mearsheimer or Stephen Wolf, they favor what's called offshore balancing. Offshore balancing is a strategy, grand strategy, where they keep the power, the military power of the United States in Northern America, in the United States, in the homeland, pending any serious threat. In other words, they would have a less footprint, militarily speaking. Another one, which is favored by more progressives or Democrats, is called selective engagement, in which they are willing to leave some outside and they could engage as they see threats, and that include also sometimes humanitarian or other kind of engagement, like what happened in Kosovo or Bosnia or other places. And then there are 2 other grand strategies. One is called liberal hegemony, which means they want to become basically everywhere and try to change the world into their image using liberal values as they express them, as they define them. And this is what happened, actually. This is the strategy that was adopted by Clinton and after that by Bush. And particularly when you have a single pole in the system, unipolar, that's what the United States was between 1991 and almost 2017, when Trump took over because of the rise of China, which I will talk about briefly. The United States enjoyed that unique moment. Never in the history of the world you had one pole in the system, a unipolar, where it dominated everything. That gave it the opportunity to choose this grand strategy of liberal hegemony in order to go and try to impose in the world, particularly in places where it felt that it was threatened, as it did after 9/11, in which it can impose its model and impose its system. And of course, if they fail, they don't really pay a lot of cost for that. There is very little cost to pay when you are that powerful. So you can afford to fail and still not pay a heavy price. And that's what happened. I mean, the United States, after after the 9/11, they could have reassessed and tried to understand what happened there and why it happened. And could it be because of its policies? Or is it because, as they said at the time, that these people hated our freedom, our system of government, democracy, and so on and so forth. And they wanted to change us, but because we can't, we're not going to change, then we have to change them. So we go to them. They never really took seriously that the problem was associated with their policies. They just assumed that these people just hate our system and we're going to go and give it to them. And of course, that policy stayed for almost 2 decades, the so-called global war on terror, and they invaded Afghanistan, then Iraq, and it was a colossal failure. We can talk about that if people would like to, but the bottom line is the United States was defeated, but yet still the most dominant pole in the system because of this overwhelming power. But what that achieved is that the US, back in 1992, when it was coming out of that Cold War as the sole power in the world, a lot of people warned that they still need to check these emerging powers, such as China. But there was a more prevailing view in Washington at the time is that if we can empower certain states economically, then eventually their political systems will change and they will become part of our system. In other words, they will adhere to our system, change their systems, and accept our leadership and primacy, and that would be the end of history. And of course, that didn't pan out. That didn't work out very well. The Chinese economy in 1992 was approximately $427 billion compared to the US economy, which exceeded, I think, $6.5 trillion. In other words, the Chinese economy was less than 7% of the America's economy. Yeah. By now, a quarter of a century or a little more, or less than 30 years or so, you find that the Chinese economy is almost over 70% of America's economy. That sounded alarms, and that's why most people started saying that we wasted 2 decades in these worthless, meaningless wars in the Middle East, instead of paying attention to that emerging threat, the rise of China. Because the saying, according to American interpretation of things, is that if a power if an emerging power starts becoming very powerful economically, that power one day will transform into a military power, which would threaten the primacy and the hegemony and control of the United States. And that's where we are today. Basically, we have a situation where the US and at least the foreign policy elite within the United States see China, or the rise of China, as being the greatest threat of the United States. Now, if we look at a table of raw power and try to conduct a comparison between these emerging powers, on one hand, the United States, China, even Russia, you'll find that Russia is not really a great power in the general sense, traditional sense. But what it is, it's a threat because of its nuclear capacity. It has thousands and thousands, almost 6,500 nuclear warheads. And that's why the United States would have to consider Russia as being a part of the threat that it could engage. Now, very quickly, I want to talk about the Ukraine war, is that the United States looked at Russia, and for a while, Russia just was very weak and did not pose any threat to the United States. And the US wanted to basically take advantage of that moment to expand NATO. And of course, for NATO to exist, that means there has to be an enemy. But also, NATO had to exist for the US to assert its power over Europe. Because if the US withdraws from Europe, there is a chance, though remote, that Europe might come together and form a bloc. Economic bloc is not a problem, but if it forms a military bloc, that could also potentially challenge the primacy of the United States. So the United States wanted to stay in Europe in order to maintain that hegemony, that control over Europe. Europe is on paper very powerful, but in reality is very weak for many reasons. Least of which is that it doesn't really have any kind of collective military policy or posture. So the United States keep that. But then the United States wanted to expand. NATO was established in 1949, and then by the fall of the Soviet Union, there were only 16 members. But since then, it became 30 members through different kinds of expansions, the first of which came in 99, and then 2004 and beyond. And in 2008, the members of NATO asserted, even though Russia was not really a threat in any way, there was no military threat posed by Russia to any of its neighbors, they decided also to go and acquire, or at least invite, Ukraine and Georgia, which by that time Putin was entrenched in Russia. He was really powerful, and he drew a red line that this is going to be very dangerous for Russia, particularly that a lot of NATO countries have been at Russia's border, but with Ukraine, they will be deep into that. There will only be 600 miles between a NATO country and Russia, which means that this is the gravest threat. So he drew the line and considered it as an existential threat, but they didn't take him seriously. They expanded military bases, such as in Romania and Poland. They canceled many nuclear agreements, including INF, the Intermediate Nuclear Force, which really meant that they can place nuclear weapons in the heart of Europe or at the border of Russia with nothing to protect it. They of course had many sanctions against Russia. They fomented what's called the color revolutions that eventually could catch up in Russia and really threaten the regime there. They actually sponsored the coup in Ukraine itself in 2014 in order to force the system or the political system in Ukraine to become part of NATO and the European Union. They canceled the open skies. They opposed Nord Stream. When you put all where you have the transportation of oil and gas. So when you put all these together, Russia felt that its existence, its future is at threat, that it faces existential threats. And of course, it gave many warnings, yet the West didn't really take them seriously, including, as I said, the building or establishment of military bases in Poland and Romania without even knowing what's there. So at any rate, we face the Ukrainian war, which Russia is not doing very well right now, even though it has on paper overwhelmingly great military hardware, yet it's losing, which tells you also that the West, and they don't deny that, had put a lot of its, particularly the United States, of its capacity to push Russia towards ruin or towards defeat. And of course, if that happens, then Russia will no longer be of course, with the exception of the nuclear arsenal it has, it will not be any, it will not play any major role in shaping the world order. On the other hand, Russia is pushing hard and is not going quietly, and is trying to also consolidate its relationships and build a new regime because it has been kicked out of many of the economic structures and economic institutions. And it's trying with China to build a new system. The problem here, of course, is that Russia's objectives and China's objectives are not necessarily the same. China wants to become dominant in its region, particularly because of the Taiwan issue, but also it does not have the imperialistic history that goes with other European powers. There is no history that China would send its armies and control others. The problem here is you have a different political system. The gamble that the US elites had is that with the progress economically of China, that there will be a change in the political institution or the political structure of China. That didn't happen. And by the time they woke up to this fact, they're trying to see what they could do about it. So you see that Biden, in his latest national security strategy, which came last month, they identify that the major geopolitical competition or geopolitical threat to them is China and the rise of China. And they say how they're going to use both hard, soft, and smart power in order to confront that threat. But they also identify another threat, which they call transnational threats, things like climate change, pandemics, energy supply, food security, technology transfer, and so on and so forth. And these two major threats that the United States is facing, when you look closely at and say how we're going to resolve this, you'll find that they are contradicting. Meaning, if they want to face the rise of China, that means they have to adopt certain strategies, such what they're doing today with trying to destroy their communication company, Huawei, and also at the same time to try to isolate them from many technology and high-tech chips and so on and so forth. At the same time, they want China's cooperation to face the transnational threats. So you can't have it both ways. You can't be against China on one hand and with China on the other hand. So they're trying to navigate through these two things and see how they can, at one point, press China in order its rise would be much slower, and try to isolate it from the high-tech industry. At the same time, convince China to be cooperative on the other matters. But also you'll find that what this national security document says, that today we're facing democracies versus autocracies. And here, the United States is trying to highlight its ideological phase, which for a long time, particularly during the Cold War, trying to say that this is, we are the defenders of democracy, of freedom, of the rule of law, of an ordered world, of human rights, and so on and so forth. But when you examine this closely, you will find the United States is not that. I mean, just look at the areas around the world. It sponsored many military coups in Latin America from the 50s onward. It sponsored, it was behind the coup or the return of the Shah in 1953 against a democratically elected government of Muhammad Mossadegh, and it kept that brutal regime for decades. It was in 1992 when the Algerian elections took place. It looked the other way when the Algerian army canceled the election and started a 10-year war against its citizens, where over 100,000 people died. It asked for democratic elections, and when the Palestinians elected a government where Hamas was the winner, it isolated that and tried to kill and undo the will of the Palestinian people. When the Egyptians elected for the first time a president with overwhelmingly over another one, when he was overthrown by a military coup, it didn't lift a finger to change that reality. Even when the Tunisian, which was probably the most mature of the countries in terms of democratic elections and democratic institutions, when that authoritarian president tried to undo all these successes, it didn't do a thing. Actually, they were dragging their feet with IMF. They didn't approve any aid for the Tunisian economy, which would have saved its democracy. Yet, when it came to Ukraine, they approved in a matter of weeks tens of billions of dollars, and they denied Tunisia $3 billion. So the record really is very bad when it comes to this thing about democracies versus autocracies. The United States doesn't care about democracies because we could see the record. The record there is very clear. The other point they're trying to talk about is that they are for the rule of law. They will try to shape the rules that govern, and that the people should respect the United Nations and you respect an ordered world. But again, here they fail miserably because they have been supporting Israel, which thwarted over 900 resolutions passed by the United Nations General Assembly and Security Council. What Israel is doing in the Palestinian situation is for all to see. The U.S. tried every policy possible to isolate Israel from any condemnation, with 46 vetoes, with not allowing any kind of United Nations sponsored negotiations. And yet today we see that what we have is still a military occupation that has existed for decades without any resolution in the horizon. And also you could see that when it comes to this rules-based, when it wanted to invade Iraq, it couldn't care less about what the United Nations or the world said about it. It went into invasion after invasion in Afghanistan and Iraq, killing hundreds of thousands of people. So this thing about, you have nations on one hand who respect rules and respect authority and respect the law is meaningless. It's just not true. Now, I want to just conclude here because of the time, is that do we have a multipolar world? What's going on? Are we going to have a new world order, which is the title, which is the what was suggested to me? And here, again, when you talk to experts, we certainly have the United States still as the primary world power. And what it's trying to do is to maintain that status. That's the grand strategy of the United States. It wants to maintain its primacy as the only hegemonic power, but even if it has to admit to the existence of other emerging powers, that these powers are not allowed to be hegemonic in their own regions, such as China. When you look at other parts or other possibilities of poles in the system, for Russia, this is going to be the major outcome of the Ukraine war. If Russia wins, meaning its political aims are matched, it will become a pole, not a very powerful, but a pole nonetheless. And if it doesn't, if it gets defeated, most likely Russia will disappear from being a major power in the world, even though it has thousands and thousands of nuclear weapons. So that is yet to be determined. But when it comes to China, China is certainly a rising power. And I think within a decade or two, it will emerge also as a military power. It just finished its first fleet. The US has 11 fleets, and of course, it's a state of the art. It will take some time for it to emerge as a military power. But if it's going to assert that power within its own region, which is the South China Sea, East China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, and so on and so forth, that's going to mean that there is a possibility of a military confrontation, not particularly with the United States, but even with with some of its neighbors. So it depends what would be the policy of China. Whether of course, so far, China is maintaining that this is a peaceful rise with its Belt and Road Initiative, where it's trying to expand in trade, in economy, in different parts of spheres, but not militarily. And as I said, it doesn't have the history behind any kind of military expansion yet. It's going to be an interesting situation by the year 2035 or 34 or 40, 45, what the situation would be. Are we going to have a new architecture or not? Another scenario, of course, is that the Russian-Chinese alliance, along with many powers in the global south, that could include Brazil, since they just elected Lula da Silva. That could also include perhaps Iran and maybe Turkey, although there are a lot of doubts about that because Turkey is also embedded in NATO and European trade, and other powerful nations in the world to establish their own system. That would be particularly financially, because once Russia was cut off the financial system, that meant basically that either it will go away or adhere to the dictates of the West or build its own system. That's not an easy thing to do. But I think a player here that has not emerged yet, but it has always been in the column of the United States, is the heart of the Muslim world. Because we saw, and this is where I would like to end, we saw during the Arab Spring that there were popular movements coming all over the place, which would assert the people's will. That will was thwarted by counter-revolutionary forces, particularly coming from the Gulf, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, in which with the tacit or their tacit alliance with Israel and the United States to thwart that will. Now, whether the people would stay dormant or whether a new wave of revolutions would take place that will assert themselves and start building a sort of a rising power or rising, I would say, emerging powers that could ally themselves with the new world order against these imperialist policies, but particularly against the hegemony of Israel, because Palestine being the central cause of the of these people, the central cause of the Arab world, of the Islamic world, of the freedom-loving world, that could alter many calculations. Because then, how do we measure whether the U.S. power is going up or down, rising or declining? It's in simple measures, in the primacy of the dollar, where the dollar would, the use of the dollar would decline, in the closing of military bases, but most importantly, in the dismantlement of the Zionist state. In other words, if there is a project to de-Zionize Palestine and it becomes the major cause of many people from the global south, as well as the freedom-loving people, and if that is defeated, if that project is realized, then you're talking about a whole new calculation, a whole new world order, and the decline of the U.S. primacy, and perhaps a more just world. Let me stop here and give you the opportunity for any questions and answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor, for giving us a valuable lecture, and also important for us to learn from the history and until now. We can see here easily that the foreign policy is important, and it's not like actually a straight line. There are a lot of mathematics in international politics. So we can maybe compare it with poker, not like a chess. I mean, it's not like only state or some only with relief on some strategies. But one thing is very important, that we, as a Muslim, we have to have the military powers also to gain the economical powers. And these are the importance. And to have this, we should have some good strategies. We should have some good strategies to follow. And that's why we need intellectuals, also like our honorable guest. So as a Muslim youth, we are living in a world where we should be aware which war or which strategy is suitable for us and which is not. I mean, we shouldn't just jump to any group or any party by just seeing anything in front of us, but not thinking deeper. Maybe in some war we should be silent, or maybe in some war we have to take a part just for the betterment of the Ummah. But it doesn't mean that we have to involve in everything. So thank you again, Professor. I would like to have some questions. I would like to give the chance to Brother Riaz Ahmed first. Brother, please ask your question.
Am I audible properly? Hello?
Hello? Yes, could you please?
Okay, my question is, thanks for such a discussion about the world's condition and economic history and formation of something deeper than we can imagine. I have to know something critical about Russia and China. As we know that Russia has become a nuclear threat and China has become at the parallelly economic threat. So my question is, who will lead the next world? And simultaneously, what is the lackings of present world leading US?
Can you repeat? It's breaking up. I did not hear the whole question.
My question is, Russia has been a nuclear threat to the world, and China has been an economic threat to the world. And who will lead the world in the future? And what is the lackings of US?
Okay. You want me to answer now or take a group of questions?
Professor, it's up to you. If you say
Well, in terms of who will lead the world, as I said, right now the United States is setting most of the rules that shaped the world in the aftermath of World War II, and most of the institutions is under its tutelage, it's under its control. You know, most of the third world countries or the global south, their economies are controlled by the IMF and World Bank, which is under the control of the US and its allies. It's very difficult to change this, because that means you really have to do a lot of things to get out of that system, including, of course, major powers and the change of the economic system as well. And that's going to take time. So for the time being, this architecture, this structure is ruling. Whether the Chinese or China would have the intent or the will or the capacity to change that, I think at one point it will have the capacity, but whether it will have the will is a different thing, because it is also benefiting from this world, from these rules. Now the United States is trying to deny it, the benefits of it. We'll see what happens. In terms of Russia, I think what would determine Russia's future is going to be the outcome of the Ukrainian war. If they come with their political aims realized, achieved, I think they will have probably a role in shaping tomorrow's world. But if they come defeated or totally destroyed in terms of their political aims, then I think that will be the end of Russia as we know it. There will be a new kind of Russia, but I don't think it will be able, because economically speaking, it can't really do much. Russia can make a difference in terms of its weapon sales and weapon manufacturing abilities, and through obviously sophisticated weaponry, and also its energy or oil supply. But if its military hardware or military machinery proves to be inferior to Western, I think that would do away with one of its sources of power. Now, in terms of the question about the lackings of the United States, or what could be the threats of the United States, there are many threats that could watch. I didn't have time to go over it, but maybe it's a good time now, that the United States is facing problems, first of all, within its own, internally, within its own society. There's a lot of problems within American society, least of which is the right versus the left, or the conservatives, or the neocons, or the Trump, the Trumpists, or the people who have great difficulty understanding the liberal aims of the United States. We could see that very vividly in the last few elections, and also with the supporters of Trump. This schism, this polarization within American society is what could undo actually American power. It's going to have a great impact, not just in the next couple of years with the upcoming elections in 2024, but I think even beyond. But also you have deeper problems such as xenophobia, racism, Islamophobia, and other parts of, and now even we see the spread of anti-Semitism. All these kind of threats also could, and with economic dislocation that takes place, that could also undo many, could weaken the United States deeply. Also, you look at the rich-poor, the inequality that takes place in the United States. There are probably about 40%, a lot of people are surprised at this, maybe 40% of US population, they are one check away from going in the streets. Most don't have more than 1,000 or 2 in their bank accounts. They're about 40%, that's a lot of people. So the United States trying to deal with these issues by printing more money and throwing social services, but still there are deep structural problems within US capitalist system that it's going to be very difficult to fix with the current power structure and the Supreme Court and so on and so forth. And I think for the US to decline worldwide, that is, it will no longer be the dominant pole, that means it really has to weaken much inside the country. This is some of the things. And of course, I said the decline of the dollar worldwide, which a lot of systems or a lot of governments could play a role on, that would be a good sign to see. The military bases, if they start winding up military bases around the world, they have 800 now, that could also be another sign. And a chaos in the world. I mean, the United States likes to have stability. Even though they withdrew from the Middle East, they know that they cannot afford to have so many wars and so much chaos. So they try to have things under control. So the more you see these things, the more it will be a sign of the decline of American primacy. But it's not going to go away suddenly. These things take time.
Thank you, Professor, for your answers. I have some questions also, but I will try to take it serially. Brother Abdurrahman Jami.
Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, I would like to thank our Honorable Professor Dr. Sami Al Arian for having us in this wonderful seminar. Professor Dr. Sami Al Arian, I have, after hearing your whole lecture in this hour, I have a lot of questions has been in my mind, and you have talked about grand strategy questions, policy questions, and the domination of dollar. So I have 4 questions in my mind. If you have a limitation of time, you can skip one of them, no problem. The first question is mine is, how can we exit, or how we can spread out from the circle of the dollar system? Because if we, what can be the next movement, or what can be the advanced solution for the whole Muslim Ummah and for the new world, where we can be a great money system? And you know that Professor Dr. Najmuddin has been talking about the dinar system, which can lead us to a powerful strongness. So in this time, we are seeing that we are living in an age of electronic money and Bitcoin. So our dinar system will be applicable, or it can be stand by the against of the dollar system, or we have to think more of them. We have to think more advantage, so that we are living in the system of the Bitcoin or electronic money. My second question is that, you know that America, United States, United Kingdom, Russia, and the whole Europe, they are having nuclear weapon. And anytime they can make a chaos, and they can fight with them. So, but in this time, in the Muslim world, has none of the nuclear weapon until Iran has doing something great. So what will be our situation when they will make a great chaos? My third question is that we are seeing the rising moment of China and Russia. So we are living beside Bangladesh. We are living exactly here, Bangladesh, and China is a sub country of us. So we're going to have a great economic depression? Is we're going to be colonized by China economically? And the last thing is that in this moment, how can we solution the problem of Palestine? I'm very sorry, I have a lot of questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your questions. These are very good, pointed questions. On the issue of the dollar, how do we get out of the dominance of the dollar? That is not something that people can actually do on their own. This is really a question of, as you pointed correctly, Erbakan tried to address the late Najmuddin Erbakan, the Turkish former prime minister and Islamic leader, by suggesting 8 major Muslim countries coming together and do the bulk of trade among them and try to establish their own currency. He obviously understood the problem and offered a solution. The problem is everything is connected. So for Turkey, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Iran, Egypt, Nigeria, Malaysia, Indonesia to come together and do this, that would mean several things. The implication then is that the major trade is between these countries. But the fact of the matter, that is not the case. The major trading partner of Turkey is Europe and the West. and then you have other countries. So we really have to alter the economic system, and that needs a political will. And that means that people have to accept certain pain that will come with that. Granted, these countries, particularly in the global south, they don't have the most advanced economies or technology. That means to bring their economies into that way, that means they have to sacrifice. That means they need perhaps not accept certain comforts of life that they are used to now in order to build this system for the next generation. That is not an economic decision. That is a political decision, a societal decision. So is it possible? Yes. Is it probable? I would say no, because I don't think we have the willpower for that to take place, unfortunately. The monetary system is something that is humanly invented and constructed, and it could also be humanly invented and constructed in a different way. But what it needs is a sovereign and independent political will that is lacking right now. Most of the rich countries in the Muslim world today are countries that are deeply connected with and linked to Western economies, particularly in the Gulf. If you look at the Gulf countries, by the way, if we look at the, this is very unfortunate, but it's a fact of life. If you look at the economies of the 57 countries, and their GDP of the Muslim countries, you'll find almost less than 8 or 9 countries, particularly the Gulf countries, the 6 Gulf countries plus 1 or 2, they construct about 50% of the economy. So if these countries are not part of a system, then that system would certainly fail. Now, on the issue of nuclear weapons, it's obviously something that is a monopoly. We know there are 8 countries, declared countries, that have it. The 5 big ones, and Israel, North Korea, 9. Israel, North Korea, India, and Pakistan. There's a lot of talk that Iran is trying to break into that group. There's no evidence. There's evidence that it has the technology to do that. There is no evidence that it has it or it wants it. But I think eventually we have to answer this question, because you don't want monopolies, nuclear monopolies, to have this gun at your head. And there are many ways of doing this without having to spend hundreds of billions of dollars to reach that. One of it is to get a nuclear cover from Pakistan. If Pakistan is willing to say that if any Muslim countries is threatened, then we will extend to it a nuclear cover, I think that will solve some of the problem, not all. But also there are other ways of dealing with this. But embarking on a nuclear arms race is going to be very costly and not needed. It can be neutralized by other ways. On the issue of the rising of China and Russia, and whether Bangladesh or other countries could be colonized economically by China, again, this is something that is left to the countries in question. It is the people in Bangladesh who can decide whether they will be colonized or not colonized. These are human decisions that need to be debated, that need to be discussed. There are a lot of interests in these countries that could probably sway the decision one way or another, but a truly independent country that embodies the will of its people would not allow itself to be colonized by anyone, politically, economically, militarily, or otherwise. So I can't predict what's going to happen. I think China would like to have as much influence, as much dominance, as much control as possible. I don't think they will resort to military conquests, but I think they would certainly try to do it by other means. The Belt and Road Initiative is one of these things, and I think people have to realize where to draw the line, so they will not, their political will not be hijacked towards other powers. The last question concerning Palestine is an important one. It takes usually a whole lecture to explain, but the bottom line is that Palestine is a very important central cause of the region, of the Muslim world, of freedom-loving world, Palestine cannot be resolved by Palestinians only. The equation that I always talk about is that Palestine cannot be resolved without the Palestinians and cannot be resolved with Palestinians alone. So we need to bring in many people to help. Why did I say that? Because my ultimate goal is not a one state or two state. All this is a mirage that's not going to work. My ultimate goal is to de-Zionize Palestine. And in order to de-Zionize Palestine, we have to dismantle the Zionist, racist, Jewish supremacist, colonialist, settler colonialist project in Palestine. To do that, you cannot compromise with that project. That project does not accept concessions and does not accept compromises. The only way to deal with it is to dismantle it. And in order to dismantle it, we need to know what are the pillars of its power, what are the imperatives that makes it expand and makes it exist. I put this in 12 different imperatives. When you look at them, you will find that the Palestinians can probably impact or affect or influence 2 or 3, which means we have to build a huge global movement to deal with the Palestinian issue. And when you deal with the Palestinian issue, when you de-Zionize Palestine, not only you're going to dismantle a racist colonial settlist regime, apartheid-like regime, but also you're going to defeat imperialist forces, colonization, you're going to defeat you're going to restore Judaism as a great religion instead of being hijacked by Zionism, but also it will be an opportunity for all freedom-loving people across the world to unite and try to decolonize and get rid of colonization and imperialism, not only in Palestine, but also worldwide. That's the encapsulation of how I see Palestine.
Thank you, Professor, for your answers, and thank you, Brother Abdul Rahman Jami. I would like to have the next question from Dr. Hisham Muharram.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. It's good to see you again, Dr. Sami. I have a question regarding the failures of the Arab Spring. The primary cause, in my opinion, was the intervention of specific, if not all, of the Gulf states. Given that there was overwhelming, I think, popular support for a change to a more just and democratic system across the Arab world, how can we prevent the same thing happening if a second wave comes about? Jazakallah khair.
Thank you. Thank you for this pointed and important question. I have a different take on this. I believe that the intervention of the Gulf states or the counter-revolutionary forces played a major part in defeating the Arab Spring. But we have to realize also that the Arab Spring as a revolutionary movement towards change or transformation of societies was not complete. It never embraced the needed goals for a true revolution. A true revolution is willing to topple the old system with a new system where the elites or the people who are benefiting from power and wealth in the old regime would no longer be in control. That never happened. That was never the aim of these movements, nor it happened. It didn't happen in Egypt, didn't happen in Tunisia, and certainly not in the other countries. So just to give you also my theory of this, I believe that a revolutionary change to take place in the Arab world, in any part of the world, needs to have success factors. And for revolutions, there are 15 success factors that did not exist. Maybe few of them existed in the Arab Spring movement, but they did not collectively exist. Revolutions are rare in the history of the world because it is very difficult to bring all these 15 factors to take place at the same time and be successful. And to run through them very quickly, there are a group of factors which we can call necessary factors, and there are 5 of them, which is the economy when it is squeezed and when it deteriorates, that affects the middle class. Second is the the government services, particularly those that impact the poor class. And then we have the elites. When they start not protecting the existing regime, they no longer feel the need to protect it or be part of it. Number four is the security situation, whether it is too brutal, where people are totally afraid, or when it is too lax, where they can actually go out. And the fifth one is the regional international factor. Of course, each one have to be understood within its own context. And of course, these 4 or 5 of them do exist in many of the Arab countries today. There are also a set of local factors. Now, they differ from place to place. The factors that exist in Egypt could be different from Yemen, from Libya, from Cuba, from Mexico, from Russia, Nicaragua, Iran, and so on and so forth. Each place have different factors. In case of Egypt, there are 3 major factors that could be cited here. One has to do with the social movements and different social strata within society, and such as workers versus farmers versus maybe even homemakers, judges, army officers, and so on. So each one will have a different reason to have an uprising or to be discontent with the system. The second is political parties and political movements. They will also have their own demands and their own reasons. And the third is the geographies. What will make a particular geography have an uprising could be different. You know, the Upper Egypt from Lower Egypt, from Sinai, from Suez, and so on and so forth. These are major factors that need to be looked at carefully and see how they would impact a revolution. The third set of factors, which are structural factors, unfortunately, they did not exist in any of the Arab Spring, and that meant that they will ultimately fail. There was no theory or philosophy impacting these revolutions, and that was basically very, very important. You have to have a revolutionary theory that you're going to have an uprising in order to attain. The general slogans that they have, such as social justice, freedom, and the human dignity, these are just slogans. You cannot bring a theory behind it. There has to be an ideology, a theory behind it. Number 2 is leadership. We didn't have any revolutionary leadership in any of these uprisings, and that's a source of weakness, not a strength. And third, you need to have the vanguard, the people who are willing to sacrifice, the people who are leading this, but also willing to sacrifice themselves. Fourth, you have to have a revolutionary army, people who are willing to go to the streets, not for 18 days, but for 18 months. And number 5, it has to do with the apparatuses, with the structures. You have a little bit of that because you have some organized movements such as the Muslim Brotherhood, but they are not organized for a revolution. They are organized for a social movement. So you have some organization, but not geared towards a revolution. And number 6 is the strategy. You really have a total lack of strategy in all of these movements. They have a little bit of action for a few days in the case of Tunisia and Egypt and others, but they lacked a complete integrated strategy to complete the transformation into a new system. And finally, resources. And this is lacking and still lacking today. These are 15 factors. As you could see, what actually took place was no more than 3 or 4, which meant that these revolutions, this Arab Spring, will not succeed. So the impact of the counter-revolutionary was very easy to defeat it because they could not do it. They did not have the others in place. So it was very easy to defeat.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Sami Al Arian. Maybe we can have one more question, the last question. I would request Brother Nazmul Saqib Naim.
Assalamu alaikum, Professor. My previous audience asked a question about China and Russia, but my question is about the United Kingdom. So if we look back, we can say that before 20th century, most of the part of the world is under the domination of United Kingdom. But nowadays, America is playing this role. So my question is why United Kingdom is not interfering in any affairs of America? Why they become like this, like they have no power, they're powerless? And is there any chance of them to return back to the domination, to the role of domination? And did they accept America as the ruler? And if so, why?
The United Kingdom is not a powerful country when compared to great powers. It is a relatively powerful country, particularly in some areas such as science, technology, research, perhaps even in some military and culture, but it does not rise to the point of being a dominant or global power. That was cemented not only after the end of World War II, but also after their defeat and withdrawal in 1956 from the Suez Canal. The United Kingdom has already asserted itself over and over and over again to be a very junior partner to the empire, to the US empire. And therefore it benefits from that empire, but it is unable to compete in any way, shape, or form. In the 19th century, it was the dominant power while the US was rising. But since that time, the US was rising while the United Kingdom was declining. After World War II, after World War I, they were still relatively strong. Let's remember that in the 19th century, the dominant navy in the world was the British Navy, but in the 20th century, by far, it was the American Navy. So there is really no comparison. I don't think there is a desire whatsoever for the United Kingdom or any of its elites to compete with the US. They cannot compete with the US. The United Kingdom is very poor in resources when it comes to the United States. When you look at its military power, it's extremely humbling when you compare what they have to what the US has to offer. So why should they compete and exhaust their resources? The United Kingdom is 60 million. Right now, if you look at any great power, they should have at least 200-300 million people. Even Russia, with its 146 million, is not considered a great power today. And the United Kingdom is less than 80 million. So you don't expect them at all to become, or I don't think even they have the will or desire to do that. So it's a moot point. But tagging themselves along to become a junior partner, which the United States does not mind at all, is much better prospect for them. They can gain from that. They can cash in much more by being not only the junior partner, but also by being the former colonial power of many countries around the world. They can benefit, and they like France. France is sucking many African countries dry, particularly in West Asia and Central Asia. And they're getting billions of dollars out of that every year. And the United Kingdom can do the same. They can have these special relationships from their former Commonwealth and current Commonwealth countries without having to raise an army or even pay for it. So this prospect that could the UK be in any way, shape, or form a pole in the system, or someone that could the United States fear as a rising power, and the answer is emphatically no. They don't have the desire nor the capability of being a pole in the system. Could they aid the United States in its many strategies? Absolutely, they can, and they have. And they are part of the Five Eyes. There are 5 countries which are the closest to the United States that aids it in its projection of power around the world, mostly Anglo-Saxon. That's Britain, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. So these countries, along with the United States, are the closest to the US empire. Why would they change that and jeopardize their status?
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you, brothers and sisters, for listening the lecture with attention and preparing your questions. We would be happy to have more questions, but actually we are short of time. But maybe next time we will have our honorable guest again with different topics. Maybe then we would be able to answer your questions. I would like to pass my special gratitude to the honorable guest, Professor Dr. Sami Al Arian, especially for accepting our invitation and come here. We as an institute will be always grateful to you, and obviously we would like to have you again later. Thank you, Professor. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum.